Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back once again. I am the Beardly Gentleman from Central Ontario, Canada, and we are here today to talk about whiskey. And in particular, we are here to talk about Canadian whiskey. Now, whiskey is a very long-standing tradition with people that goes back many, many generations. There are very particular specifics when you're talking about things like Irish whiskey and when you're talking about Scotch, which is whiskey from Scotland. I am going to focus on Canadian whiskey today. I'm going to move on to Irish whiskey and to Scotch and things like that, but I'll be moving on to that at a later date. It will entail a little bit more of a history lesson and things like that. But today, for the purposes of this video, we're going to be talking about Canadian whiskey. Now, when I say Canadian whiskey, I am talking about the distillation of grain spirits. In Canadian whiskey, it can be anything from corn to barley to rye, with a lot of Canadian whiskeys often having quite a high rye content, which differs a little bit from quite a lot of American bourbons. I believe American bourbon needs to have at least 51% corn. Corn is, in this case, considered a grain along with rye and barley. So it's all pretty much done the same way. It doesn't matter where you are in Canada with the distilling process. They take their grain spirits and they basically mill them all up into what is called a mash. And then that mash is then fermented. Well, it's boiled a little bit and then it's fermented to make something that's akin to a very, very strong beer. This is usually called wash. And then the wash is taken and then put into either a copper pot still or there's a different kind of still that's very, very tall. It'll come to me eventually. But they're put in these different stills and they are distilled where the grain alcohol is actually evaporated away from the water to concentrate it down more and more and more. The first distillation that you get out of the wash is typically undrinkable. It's like jet fuel. So most Canadian whiskeys are distilled 2 or 3 times at least. Once you've done this, you get what's just referred to as typically a grain spirit. This grain spirit is then batched up into barrels. Quite often in Canadian whiskey, it's always an oak barrel. There's no specifications on what type of oak barrel it needs to be, whether or not it needs to be a charred barrel or an untouched barrel, what do they call it? Pure oak barrel or something like that, whether or not it has to be charred, whether or not it has to have had some other flavor or some other spirit in it. That's a thing that's pretty abundant in whiskey. Like you'll take for a lot of scotches are done in ex-sherry casks. But a lot of Canadian distillers like to use ex-bourbon barrels. So all the different companies that make bourbon in the States will then sell the bourbon barrels to Canadian whiskey manufacturers, and they will make Canadian whiskey in the ex-bourbon barrel. And that whatever was left of the bourbon sort of just soaked into the wood imparts that little bit of flavor into the Canadian whiskey. So it needs to sit in these barrels, these oak barrels, for at least 3 years. That's actually law in Canada. If it's not sitting in the barrel for 3 years, it cannot be considered whiskey. It is just grain spirit. Once it's sat in the barrels for 3 years to mature, it's maturation time. After that, it can go pretty much anywhere from there. They can take it and they can continue to mature it for as long as they want, really, or they can sell it right at that point. Now, after it's done maturing in the barrel, in Canadian whiskey, this is sort of a point of contention. You are allowed a little over 9% of what is essentially a flavoring. So it's 9.09% per volume in the bottle is allowed to be things like caramel or things like maple. There's a couple different Canadian whiskeys that actually use maple syrup. And then other fruit liqueurs. So different sort of cherry liqueur or orange is quite rampant. Apple. I don't know if it's apple cider or if it's pure apple juice, but you're allowed to add 9% per volume of any of these different things to Canadian whiskey. It's part of the law. And there's a good and a bad side to that. If you're a purist, I'm obviously not a purist in pretty much anything, and if you're looking to the Beardly Gentleman's Whiskey Reviews for a pure connoisseur's type view, you probably don't want to be here. I was looking up on YouTube. There's a guy named The Whiskey Snob, and if that really matters to you, you can go see his channel, because I'm sure that he'll probably cater more to your likes. But I'm open to anything. I am a Canadian. I really like Canadian whiskey, and there's a reason that it sells so well is because it tastes good. It's phenomenally smooth. It's world-renowned for its smoothness and its drinkability, really. And this brings me to an interesting history lesson that I actually found when I was looking up this whole idea. The whole legislation passed that allowed flavorings in Canadian whiskey actually came about around the exact same time that the United States went dry. So it was the same time when Prohibition came into be, which we've never had Prohibition here in Canada. You probably would have had riots in the streets if they had tried to take our alcohol away. We never had Prohibition, and we actually made quite a decent living off of selling illegal alcohol to the Americans. Now, the American rum runners, they were all businessmen. These weren't silly, foolhardy people. They knew how to make a buck, and they knew that the best way to make a buck was to buy, your cheapest grain alcohol that you could get, and sell it for the highest price that the economy would possibly garner. And at that point, it was quite high because it was illegal. And the reason why we passed legislation for flavoring is because, pardon me, still getting over my sore throat. If you had seen my last video, it's part of the reason why I'm not smoking a pipe or anything right now either. I'm trying to just get over that raspiness. So for flavoring, they were buying basically the cheapest Canadian whiskey that they possibly could. But we, as entrepreneurs, wanted to still make it drinkable. So we were adding different things, maple syrup, apple cider, all these different things to make it drinkable. And that was around the same time when the cocktail actually became a big deal and everyone liked cocktails. It was around the time of the American Prohibition. So that's that whole thing went hand in hand. But as you can see with a cocktail, like whatever it is that we've done to our whiskeys made it very, very drinkable. People like to take it and mix it in drinks and this and that and the other thing. So is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's just history. I think it's down to your personal palate. And in this series that I'm going to be talking about with Canadian whiskies and then moving on to the rest of the world eventually, but with Canadian whiskies, we are actually having a resurgence of micro distilleries that are starting to get back into even your purest single malts. So I will also get into that sort of thing soon. But for today, I just wanted to give you that history sort of background and let you know what Canadian whiskey is and why it is the way it is. And to end off, just checking my notes here, I think I've covered pretty much everything that I came here to talk about, and I hope that you've learned a thing or two, and I'm going to end this whole thing off by talking about two more things. A, how I prefer to drink whiskey, which is not the way that you need to drink whiskey, it's just my preference, me showing you. And then the second thing is I'm going to do my first whiskey review-ish. It's going to be like a dry run of my whiskey review, because what I'm going to be reviewing today is actually not a whiskey, and it's just like I had mentioned earlier. It is a proto-whiskey. It's what whiskey grows up to be eventually one day. This is a grain spirit, and this is from Dillon Distilleries. Dillon Distilleries is located in Beamsville, Ontario. Their master distiller is a wonderful young gentleman who goes by the name of Jeff Dillon. And they are quite new. They didn't come into being until 2012. So by Canadian law, there's no possible way they could have a whiskey out right now because it hasn't quite been 3 years. That'll be, I think it's in the spring of 2016 is when they're going to be able to actually release their first actual barrel-matured whiskey. So for now, to try to make some money to get by, they're producing clear spirits like gin, vodka, and then this one right here, which is called the White Rye. This is just rye spirit, completely unaged rye alcohol. So this is your second or third distillation before it goes into the barrel. And I am going to take a moment now and talk to you about my thoughts on Dillon's The White Rye. Just give me a second.